Hay Festival.
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 Bienvenidos al podcast Hay Festival 2025, un espacio para imaginar otro mundo.
Bienvenidos al podcast 2025, la edición especial del podcast del Hay Festival en español, en la que celebramos el 20º aniversario de nuestro festival en Cartagena de Indias. Yo soy Catalina Gómez Ángel.
Y yo, Iñaki Lasaetura. Para celebrar este momento único para nosotros, le pedimos a nuestros seguidores que nos enviaran las preguntas que consideraban eran claves para entender el mundo en el que vivimos.
Después de un largo ejercicio, nuestro equipo ha seleccionado las 20 preguntas más significativas y para responderlas hemos reunido algunas de las mentes más brillantes y más expertas en cada tema que participaron en la más reciente edición del Festival de Cartagena en enero del 2025. Empecemos, Iñaki.
Yomi Adegoke es columnista en The Guardian y British Vogue, ha escrito para el Sunday Times, The Independent, Stylist, New Statesman y muchos más. Y además fue la presentadora del podcast Woman Prize for Fiction. En 2018 fue nombrada una de las personas más influyentes de Londres por el Evening Standard y en 2021 fue nombrada una de las 30 personas menores de 30 años de Forbes. Su último libro, The List, es un libro que se publicó el año pasado, en 2024.
Yomi, welcome to our podcast. Let's start. What value does fiction hold for society?
I think that fiction's value for society is in helping us tell the truth. I have a friend who always says to me that when he's a journalist as well, and he always says that when you are writing non-fiction, you are dealing with facts, and when you're writing fiction, you're dealing with truth. And I think that's really true. In the sense that you're often dealing with emotional truths. I think it's easier often to have more complex and more difficult conversations in fiction than it is in non-fiction. I think that's why, for instance, in my book, which looks at, kind of complicating the conversation around Me Too and looks at talking about the internet and stuff, I chose initially as a journalist to write it as, a long form article, which was going to be non-fiction. But then as time went on, I decided to write it as a fiction work. And I think that's because I knew the conversation I was having was going to be divisive. I knew it was going to be difficult. And I felt it was more comfortable, firstly, for me to have that conversation in fiction, but also for readers. I think that fiction helps us empathize. And I think during these especially divided times when, everything is very black and white, everything's very polarized in terms of how we think. I think fiction has a special and important and often undervalued space and place where people can have slightly more thorny, slightly more uncomfortable conversations. So yeah, I think fiction is for truth tellers and truth seekers.
And Yomi, in your opinion, how can we highlight and learn from non-hegemonic narratives?
I think what we can learn from non-hegemonic types of literature is, firstly, as I mentioned before, empathy. I think reading about different experiences, different types of people is crucial to understanding about different kinds of people. I feel like fiction is the cheapest form of travel that anyone can have, right? You get to experience different cultures, different landscapes, different types of people without leaving your living room. But I think when I think of what I've gained from literature that doesn't reflect me, the value has been endless. I say this a lot that, when I grew up reading books like, Pride and Prejudice, I am not a white middle-class woman in the, is it 17th century or whenever it's set. I'm not, that's not my experience. I've grown up reading predominantly about white middle-class people and it's been a window into an experience that isn't mine. And that works the other way, right? Like, I've never had issues I never felt like I couldn't relate to Harry Potter because he was a young white boy that, you know, was a wizard. I still was able to empathize with his story and his experience. I think it's the exact same thing for, you know, or it should be the exact same thing for people who are reading outside of their experiences, white people who are reading, or white men that are reading experiences of black women or people from different cultures. It's an immediate route to empathy. It's an immediate route to understanding what their experiences are. And it's interesting because when, you know, with my book and books that I've written before that are nonfiction, they have focused primarily on the black female experience or the black British experience. And I've had, you know, 90% of people have engaged with that work and said, you know, this taught me, you know, about an experience that wasn't mine. It opened my eyes, you know, it revealed something to me. But there has always been a small, you know, 5 to 10% of people that have said, I can't get into this book because I don't relate to the characters. They're not like me, which shows that we have a long way to go, because I never read Sally Rooney and was like, I'm not a white skinny woman in Ireland that studied at Trinity, so I can't get into her world. That's never stopped me from enjoying her books. I can still enjoy her books. And I think the fact that there are still 5 to 10% of people that read experiences external to theirs and feel like, you know, that means they can't enjoy the book. To me, that shows that non-hegemonic works are more important than they ever have been. We really still need to push that.
It could say it a little bit that we coming from the South or other, call it the South, or other countries that are not the Central Europe or United States, we are more used to get ourselves in that experience, to watch their movies, to read their books. And we, even if it's totally different from our life, but for them it's very difficult to put themselves in our
100%
without looking as exotic.
It's like if this is a love story between a white male and a white female, it's just a love story. But if it's a story between let's say a black woman and another black woman, it's not just a love story. It's not labeled as just a love story. No, it's a black LGTB.
100%, because the experience of white men is considered the default, is considered the standard, and everything else outside of that experience is considered a deviation and seen as some sort of remix to what the, you know, traditional experience is. But it's very true. Even with my book, I had to really push, and I'm very lucky I had great publishers that were willing to do this, but I had to make sure that it was not marketed as a black thriller or a black moral dilemma, because to me it's just a moral dilemma, because, you know, like that's as a human that's what they're experiencing. And I think it's, you know, something that publishing is getting slightly better at. We are seeing more quote unquote black love stories just being seen as love stories. We're seeing the end of what I used to call the bookshop apartheid, where, you know, you'd have romance and thriller and horror all separated out, and then you'd have black, and it didn't matter what, like black stories, it didn't matter what was happening in those stories, but they'd all be in that section. So we're seeing the end of that. But yeah, you're right, it's still anything that isn't a story about what we consider the default experience is seen as exotic, which is frustrating.
Coming from that question, we go back to our reader's question, is how to fight structural racism.
I always say, because I get asked this a lot, because the first book in particular that I wrote was kind of looking at, you know, the first book that I co-wrote with my best friend, Elizabeth Ivebenene, was kind of a guide to life aimed at black British women. And it was kind of looking at navigating the workplace as a black woman, navigating health, navigating education. And we always used to say, because the book was called Slay in Your Lane, we used to say, you can't slay your way out of systemic racism, right? You can't just, it's such a big question, because if I knew the answer to actually combating structural racism, then I like to think maybe it wouldn't exist, right? Because when we're looking at structural racism, we're looking at, you know, systems that predate all of us, things that, you know, that have been entrenched for generation after generation. So I think it's often a question for governments, for institutions, for people who are upholding those systemic, forms of racism and that structural racism that, all of us are, if not perpetrating, experiencing. I think when it comes to, I don't know if I'd use the word structural, but when it comes to trying to advise people on how they can take a stand against racism, I think it completely depends on where you exist within that system. I think allyship is crucial. I think showing up for your friends of color, showing up for your colleagues of color in the workplace, these things are crucial. But realistically, are these things going to dismantle systemic and structural racism? Probably not. So I feel like that question is a very well-meaning one, but I don't think it's something we're going to be able to answer today. I don't think it's something we're maybe going to be able to answer for 50 years, because I think we saw some real inroads being made post-2020 after George Floyd. Everyone globally started to realize at the same time racism existed, and so we saw some attempts, but now we're seeing a massive backlash. We're seeing DEI initiatives globally being scaled back. We're seeing, Trump back in government. We're seeing a real pushback against those small inroads that were made to combat systemic racism. So that's a very long way of me saying, I don't know.
Let's hope you know who you know. I'm just kidding. The next question about literature, about art, about challenges, and it's what role does literature and art play in building a more peaceful, empathetic society that it is aware of these challenges?
Okay, great. Okay. So I've already kind of touched on the idea of, literature and art and media making us, representation making us more empathetic to different experiences and exposing us to realities that we might not have ever seen before and humanizing different kinds of people. So I think I'm going to answer it from a different angle, which is I think the peace and the kind of brilliance that art can bring about for creators. Because I used to work with this charity in the UK called 64 Million Artists, and it was called that because the idea was that I think the number of people in the UK was 64 million, and the idea was that everyone in the UK and therefore everyone globally is an artist, right? And it was the whole point of the charity was to kind of show that it didn't matter if you were the best writer or if you were the best illustrator or if you were the best singer, but that there was value in creating and that there was value in being artistic. Just because I've always said this, that I think, when you're a young child, everyone is encouraged to paint and everyone's encouraged to write. And it doesn't matter if you're the best artist or if you're even good at it, but it's just something that we were encouraged to do. And then as you get older, you stop doing things unless you're really good at them. So the whole point is that if you're not a brilliant poet, if you're not a brilliant writer, there's no need for you to do it. But I think the piece that, art can give us is often mentally. I mean, I'm someone who paints and I'm quite good at it. But even if I wasn't, I feel like I find joy and value and so much in my art. And I don't sell it. I don't paint for monetary reasons. I don't, I enjoy the feeling it gives me. And I think there's so many people who, I love the ideas of people that are in choirs but can't sing, and people who take dance classes but can't dance. I love that, because I think there's so much value in creativity. I think we think often as consumers, as people who are engaging with it. And I think, the value of that is obvious, and that's why I've touched on it in other questions. But I think what we less discuss is how each and every one of us has, the ability to create in some way, and there's so much value in that. And that value often is for ourselves in terms of how it makes us feel, in terms of how, it makes us think, in terms of the headspace it gets us in. So I just wish that, obviously at the Hay Festival, there's so many brilliant writers, everyone's so talented, but I guess what I'm kind of appealing for is people who don't necessarily want to sell their books or don't necessarily want to sell their artwork or don't necessarily want to dance professionally, still seeing value in it because there's so much beauty in that. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for being with us. Unfortunately, the time is over, but this is a very special edition of our podcast for 20 years of Hay Festival in Cartagena. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Gracias, Yomi, por estar con esta edición especial del Hay Festival de Cartagena y Imaginamos Otro Mundo.
Gracias por acompañarnos. Una producción de Ojo por Ojo Multimedia. Hay Festival 2025. Un espacio para que imaginemos otro mundo.